The chrome caught the sun like a promise. Harleys parked in a neat row outside Rusty's diner, their tanks sending brief, bright reflections across the cracked asphalt. Inside, the place smelled like strong coffee and grease, eggs on griddles, and the faint sweetness of old leather warmed by bodies that had ridden hard for years. The jukebox in the corner spat out an old blues tune, the kind that sounded as if it had been playing here since the world was young. A group sat at the long counter in a corner booth, patches folded into worn denim, hands stained with oil and the slow work of living. They were not the kind of men who lingered on words. They let their silence do the talking, the way a motorcycle rumbles when someone's presence fills the room. At the head of the table, with a forearm like a road map of scars and ink, Reaper lifted his coffee in a familiar, unhurried gesture and watched the morning through a visor of memory. He didn't expect a child that morning. The bell over the door jingled like a small, urgent thing. A little boy walked in, wiping his nose on the back of his hand. He had the kind of face that looked older than his years and younger than his trouble, eyes too clear for the weather he'd lived through, hair sun-bleached at the edges. He carried a small paper envelope and a photograph folded until the creases softened into its fibers. He paused in the doorway and looked around, as if he had been sent into a quiet church to find the single man who knew how to pray. When he spotted Reaper, he walked straight up to the table as if he'd been expected. He didn't stammer. He didn't look for permission. He held out his hand and in the breath of a breath said, "My father had that same tattoo." Silence is a heavy thing. For a second, it was the only sound. Coffee cups, tiny islands on the table, the jukebox a distant heartbeat, the chrome of the bikes outside glittering with indifferent light. The men looked at each other the way men who have shared a road check their bearings. Reaper's hand moved to his forearm before his head did, as if his body remembered a language his conversation hadn't been given time to learn. On his inner wrist, halfway between tendon and knuckle, was a small, faded ghost, more suggestion than figure, an outline of something that looked like it belonged to a child's drawing, but carried the weight of a man's story. The boy pointed at it with the blunt insistence of a child with truth in his hand. "My name's Ethan," the boy said. "Ethan Cole. That was my dad's." The room moved, not with drama, there wasn't time for that, but with the slow, righteous force of recognition. Blackjack let out a sound that might have been a laugh at another time. Tank's big hand closed on the table so hard the spoon near it jumped. Wrench's brow folded, like tightening a wrench on a stubborn bolt. Smoke, who never spoke much, looked down at the floor as if he could find the exact place the past had left off.
"Daniel Cole," Reaper said at last, the name as precise as a key. "We called him Ghost." Ethan reached into the envelope. He had been told to find them on Sundays. Rusty's Diner, 8:30, the back of his father's letter had said. He unfolded the photograph. A smaller man with the same hollowed humor in his eyes, arms slung around a younger Reaper's shoulder, in a picture that looked like a night stolen from a harder life. On the back, in a looping hand, a sentence, "If you ever need them, find them at Rusty's. Love, Dad." There was a second note folded under the picture, edges softened by fingers that had written and reread. Ethan's voice was steady, small, as he read it aloud. "If you see this, it's because I couldn't fix everything. They promised, if I ever needed them, to look after what's left. Please. Mom is sick." The word sick landed in the room like a stone. Reaper remembered the weight of that kind of stone. He remembered the angles that had kept men from seeing a way through. He remembered, with a clarity one does not invite, 2 nights that had made the name Ghost more than a nickname. He told the story without pretense, because stories like that are kept by the hands that lived them, not by the mouths that fancy them. "He saved me twice," Reaper said. The diner slid into a close attention, the kind paid when a man holds out the spine of his life and expects the room to fold around it. The first time was the road outside Reno. Reaper had been younger and too sure of his own invulnerability. A truck had come at a corner too fast. It had seen him as something to avoid at the last moment. Daniel Cole had shoved him clear, taken a hit meant for someone else, and walked away with a hip that never turned the same again. The second time was quieter and less visible, the sort of rescue that does not make headlines. A man had been at the end of himself, and Coast had found him on a back porch at dawn, sat until daylight made things explainable, and drove a man back toward the life that needed him. They owed him nothing, Blackjack said, voice rough and soft in the same line. Because that's what he was. He didn't keep score. There was a kind of reverence in the dry way he said it, like talking about a favorite song or a gun that had never failed. Ethan watched them as if cataloging who they were. "My mom, Sarah, she has fibrosis," he told them, the words a small, clinical thing without theatrics. "They said there's no cure. She needs surgery, but we can't pay. And Mr. Donnelly is going to lock us out next week if the rent isn't paid. She can't keep the place." Reaper's jaw tightened. The men started to move in ways that had nothing to do with the inside of conversation. A coin of decision slid through the air. Look away or do the thing that honor requires. "How long you been on your own, kid?" Tank asked, the question low and practical. "Since last year," Ethan said. "Dad left to keep us safe."
He told Mom it was better if he wasn't there. He didn't say the rest. He didn't have to. The men in the room read the silence like a blueprint. Reaper looked at the photo again. There was a crease running through Ghost's face where the paper had been bent, proof of hands that had carried it. He thought about the kind of man who would make the choice to leave a family to keep them safe. That choice had a weight to it, and like all heavy things, it required a place to be born. "Stay," Reaper said. "Sit down. Tell us everything." Ethan sat at the end of the table opposite Reaper like a small island. He pushed the photograph and note over to Tank, who thumbed the edge with fingers that could mend more than motors. Wrench leaned forward and asked for details in that precise way only someone who has to fix things would. Birthdays, names of doctors, the name on the lease, whether Sarah had a phone, whether there were bills and envelopes waiting to be opened. "You got a bag?" Smoke asked. He was the kind of man who asked about practicalities, because kindness without structure can be a kind of cruelty. Ethan tapped a small backpack. Inside, a sweater, a crumpled set of homework papers, a little notebook in which his father had written errands and grocery lists, small acts recorded so one could be remembered in the business of ordinary days. "What's his name, the landlord?" Blackjack wanted to know. "Rick Donnelly," Ethan said. The name had the softness of a man who'd live on other people's unease. They had met that kind of man before. Polite offices, polite refusals, polite threats in inked letters. Reaper's face shadowed. They talked in low bursts after that, the steady, decisive language of men who planned with hard hands. A ledger of needs took shape on the diner table. Money for back rent, immediate cash for medication, someone to sit with Sarah when the surgery happened, a place for the boy to stay. Decisions that had nothing to do with grand statements of righteousness and everything to do with small, stubborn acts were made. They agreed to do it their way, quietly, fully, without the need for anyone to sing their own praise. Before they moved, Reaper told Ethan to wait while he stepped outside. The morning light washed over the bikes. He looked at their faces and the way they held themselves, their calloused palms, and the softening at the eyes when the boy was not looking. He thought of Ghost's note and the trust folded into paper. He thought of what a promise looked like when left in an envelope. Small, vulnerable, perfect. Reaper's voice when he returned carried the weight of a man who has carried promise before. "We ride with you," he said. "We'll get you looked after. We'll find your mom a doctor. We'll sort the rent. You come with us when we say. You come when we can keep you safe." Ethan's mouth made a small, incredulous shape. "You're serious?" Tank gave him a look like a blunt hammer, and then a softer hand on Ethan's shoulder.
"We're serious," Tank said. "We don't do theatrics." "If this story grabbed you," Reaper heard himself say, the phrase falling strange and out of place in the middle of a decision that mattered, "stay with us. The heart of this starts after we leave this diner." It was an odd thing to say in a diner to a child clutching a photograph, but it had the flavor of what Reaper had learned. Truth has to be told plainly, or it disintegrates under its own ornamentation. The men smiled in ways that meant something private and old. Ethan, perhaps not understanding the shape of that promise, nodded like a man accepting an offer too large to refuse. They didn't announce to the world what they planned. Announcements were for people who wanted permission to do the kind of damage that needs permission. Instead, they folded intent into movement. Wrench collected a small stack of cash from his worn wallet and drove to the branch where he kept essentials. Blackjack promised to find out which surgeon at the county hospital could do the kind of operation Sarah might need. He knew people with straight lines who moved through bureaucracies like fingers through gears. Smoke arranged with a nurse he'd met once to pull together medical records. Tank loaded toolkits, blankets, a spare twin mattress from the back of the clubhouse. Reaper called in a favor with the chapter's bookkeeper and had the account numbers ready for rent and emergency payments. They were not saints. They were men who had done things that had cost them sleep. They were also men who understood the arithmetic of needs and the way a small outlay in the present could prevent ruin in the future. On paper, it was about money and logistics. In practice, it was the translation of a promise. A map was drawn in the air, almost without words. Reaper would go to Sarah's apartment first, confirm the situation, and hold her hand if she'd let him. Tank would ride to transfer the bed and the mattress. Wrench would come with his van and list of tools that doubled as bargaining chips. Blackjack and Smoke would be the watching, the paperwork, and the voice that got people through waiting rooms and under the right lights of doctors' attention. The brothers would split cash and errands. They would move carefully with the kind of dignity that comes from knowing what it is to be on the receiving end of charity and the way it stings when it's clumsy. Before leaving, Reaper folded the photograph and put it inside his shirt against his chest. He wanted the image near his heart the way one carries a compass. He remembered the night's ghost had sat with them, the small talk about nothing that lasted until the early hours and then followed them into the day. He could still hear the quiet of Daniel's laugh. They left Rusty's diner like people who had rehearsed leaving a dozen times in the night. The engines turned over one by one, an orchestra of low throbs and patience.
The sunlight hollowed into lanes as they took the road, bikes following in a line that was both procession and protection. Ethan rode on the back of Tank's bike, his small body tucked against a leather jacket that smelled like motor oil and cinnamon from a diner napkin rubbed into a pocket. Reaper followed, slow and unhurried, like a man escorting a promise down a street where the light had not yet decided whether it would be kind. The city rolled by in a blur of chain-link fences and tidy lawns, the kind of places you thought safety lived in, until you learned safety was a fragile thing. Ethan watched windows and doors with the wary curiosity of a child who had learned to measure a world by thresholds. When they passed a playground, he turned for a second and saw the swing moving in a hollow wind. He put his small hands on Tank's jacket like they were grabbing on to a future. Reaper felt the fragment of a life in his hands, some small, urgent thing. He had to make sure he handed it back larger and steadier than when he received it. The promise was not a headline. It was a sequence of acts: put money where it is needed, get the right medical people to care, keep a child warm, make a home, not a stopover. He thought of how Ghost had given up being there in body so that Sarah and Ethan would not pay for that presence with a danger he could not bear. That choice hung in the air like an unfinished sentence, waiting for someone else to finish it. When they arrived at the address, the building looked as if it had been built against time, with layers of paint and the small tameness of rented lives. A truck with a dented bumper bore the landlord's name on its side, Donnelly Property Management. A notice was taped to the door of Sarah's apartment, a bureaucratic punctuation mark that clerked away a family's right to shelter if a number on a sheet wasn't matched by a number in a bank. Ethan's hands went cold inside the jacket. He clutched the photograph again and then put it away as if covering the past would make it less sharp. Reaper knocked on the door with the flat, certain rhythm of someone who had knocked on doors that required a different sort of conversation. The door opened to a woman who smelled faintly of eucalyptus and the kind of fatigue that writes itself on the edges of a face. Sarah Cole looked like someone who had been keeping an impossible ledger, moments of joy placed next to appointments and unpaid bills. She saw the bikes and the men, and for a breath she did not place them into the story she had been telling herself so far. Her hands trembled when Reaper handed her the photograph, and the note had been smoothed again by the act of being read aloud in a place full of men who had ridden long enough to know the weight of a promise. She read her husband's looped handwriting, and something softened in her face. Not joy, this wasn't a Hollywood pivot, but a deep, precise relief that had room in it for grief and gratitude.
"I don't know what to say," she whispered. The sound was small, honest, and too human to be melodramatic. "Don't say much," Reaper told her with the bluntness of someone opposed to theater. "Let us do the rest." They moved into action with an economy that has nothing to do with heroics. Tank and Wrench carried out a twin mattress on a dolly as if they'd been doing it all their lives, which they had in one way or another. Blackjack opened a small duffel and handed Sarah an envelope with the rent for the next month and an earnest note about future arrangements. Smoke sat with Sarah on the couch and took her hand the way a steady object takes weight. There were complications, small, stubborn things that make any sensible plan insist on patience. The landlord's truck was there, its driver a man with a crisp suit and sharp hair who read the law like it was a sword he had practiced with. Donnelly himself took one look at the bike-lined street and the men in leather and chose to make himself scarce at first. Legal notices were shown and countersigned, phone numbers were exchanged with a fine politeness that hid a threat. But when it came to the eviction, a timely stipend, a statement from the chapter's business account, and a clear human insistence that they would not be shuffling a family into the street made the difference. They did not shout, they did not break things. They presented facts, proof of payment scheduled, and a resolve that was a public assertion that Sarah Cole had a community that would not let her fall.
Donnelly made a show of consulting with a man who had to look important on a phone call, but the arithmetic of trouble does not love spectacle. It loves the straight line of someone who can make payments and who will show up for an appointment. By late afternoon, the bed was set up in the clubhouse's back room, a place that smelled of coffee and oil and the strange architecture of men who make second homes out of grease and cinder block. They had swept, scrubbed, and placed a small lamp on the nightstand. There was a stack of donated warm blankets, a small bookshelf with a few children's books Wrench had scrounged, and a little station where Ethan could do homework without the background noise of a furnace rattling in the corner. Sarah sat on the mattress and let the weight of the day go out of her shoulders for the first time in months. There was no miracle, only the carefully arranged scaffolding of help. The clock on the wall ticked into a quiet that meant something like peace. For the first night in a long string of bad nights, Sarah slept without the worry that the landlord might carve away what little they had. Ethan slept on the couch in the common room, a blanket pulled to his chin, the photograph tucked safely inside a jacket he hadn't been told to keep. In the quiet time between tides, Reaper sat at the small table and looked at the ghost tattoo on his wrist and pot of Daniel Cole. He told no one for a while.
He let the room's low hum be the answer. Plans were made for the medical dates to come, for hospital trips and for paperwork. Blackjack would shepherd the medical referrals. Wrench would set up tutoring hours so Ethan didn't lose ground in school. Tank would teach the boy to change an oil filter like a rite of passage. Smoke promised to read to him when he couldn't sleep. Each plan was a small stitch in the life they'd been asked to mend. Reaper took the folded note and slipped it into his wallet. He thought about the way a promise left in a simple hand could be the most dangerous thing in the world. You either honored it or you turned it into a weapon. He wasn't sure what the cost would be in the long run. He was sure about one thing. Ghost had left them a ledger of trust, and men who could read such pages must pay what was written. At the edge of the night, a call came through, Blackjack's voice steadier because routine had a shape to it. A specialist had agreed to see Sarah based on the notes they'd hastily assembled. There were tests to be scheduled, blood work to be taken, and a consult in a hospital 2 cities over. The surgeons were blunt and careful. They offered hope that was measurable, a procedure that might slow the progression of fibrosis and give Sarah the time to breathe deeper in ways she could not on her own. Hope like that needs scaffolding. It needed appointments kept, copays made, rides to and from a hospital that didn't always see a woman with a history in their lines. It needed someone who would wait through nights of monitors and the slow, steady beep that reads time in a surgical suite. "This is only the beginning," Wrench said in a low voice. "If we're going to get her through this, we have to be here for every little step, no skipping." They mapped it out then, the hospital dates, the visits, the paperwork. They wrote it down on a roster that Blackjack pinned to the clubhouse board like a badge of responsibilities. Names and times, shuttle drivers, who would sit in which waiting room chairs. It was simply put a plan with people behind it, the kind of plan that kept nothing to chance. When dawn came, the chapter's bikes rolled back out. They were a line of iron and purpose, engines steady. Ethan had been woken and told to pack a small bag. Sarah kissed him on the forehead with the kind of fierceness that didn't need showiness. "Be brave," she said. "Find the men with the ghosts." Reaper watched them ride out and felt the shape of a life moving from one set of hands to another. He thought of Ghost again, not as the absence he once named, but a presence that had refused leafing back into silence. He thought of promises left in envelopes, and the way small acts could become a life. They headed toward the hospital where the first consultations were scheduled.
The road was long and had the peculiar ability to make time feel the same as it always had, measured not by clocks but by the stretch of scenery and the sound of wind over jackets. Ethan kept the photograph out where he could see it, fingers tracing the fold lines, as if the creases were a map to where his father had gone. As the city seeped behind them and the highway unfurled, Reaper felt the kind of resolve that becomes habit. They had done the small thing right, so the large thing might follow. He did not know how the hospital's verdict would land or whether the money would be enough for the weeks of care Sarah needed. He only knew they would not look away. The engines hummed a steady hymn as they rode, a sound that had the authority of a promise being kept. The day would bring tests and waiting room chairs, a surgeon's careful words. It would bring small comforts and procedural procedures that required patience. It would also bring the kind of fear that lived in the quiet between questions. Their arrival at the hospital was a fit of white and glass in the bright light.
They parked not as an army, but as people carrying, each one, a backstory of a rescued life. Reaper took Ethan by the shoulder and guided him to an intake nurse, whose efficient questions were the kind that kept a place running. Blackjack had talked to the surgeon on the phone. Arrangements were in motion. The waiting room was full of soft noises, television murmurs, the scratch of a pen, the soft shuffle of someone turning a page. Men and women sat with the fatigue of those who had been holding on. Reaper sat beside Sarah and took her hand in the small, practical way he had learned. He did not offer sermons, just presence. Tank, Wrench, Smoke, and Blackjack drifted into corners like experienced badgers, watching, ready. When the surgeon finally came out, she spoke without flourish but with a clarity that held gravity. "There are options," she said, "and we can do things that will buy time and improve quality of life. It's not a simple fix, it's a path. We'll need to schedule the operation, and you'll need consistent follow-up, therapy, checkups, immunosuppressants if necessary. Recovery will be slow and careful." Sarah nodded. She was brave like many mothers are, showing courage because a child watched. Reaper listened and wrote down names and dates. He translated medical phrases into action items, phone calls, appointments, transportation. He taught himself to move in spaces he had never wanted to be an expert in. He learned how to file claims, what numbers to call, how to make sure that a hospital's bureaucracy did not drown a family in red tape. When they left the hospital that evening, it was with a map of their next steps. It was the beginning of a different kind of ride, one with fewer open roads and more waiting rooms, but with a route marked clearly by people who had chosen, for reasons both small and enormous, to keep a promise. They did not expect miracles.
They expected the harder thing, work. They expected to pay in time and labor and patience for the days they were given. That was the sort of faith that didn't shout. It simply showed up. On the ride home, Ethan sat between Tank and Reaper, his small hands in his lap. He watched faces in passing cars and wondered how his father had taught him to find the right people to trust. He thought of the note, the folded paper that had been a plea and a plan. He rehearsed in his head the parts of his life he would tell again when he was older, what it meant to have a father who left because staying would have been a worse kind of gift. Reaper glanced down at his wrist and the small ghost inked there. He could feel its edges like a bruise made soft by time. He'd been given a job that didn't come with a title, guardian of a promise. He would sit with it like a duty and a gift. The clubhouse, when they returned, hummed with the quiet of men who had done a good day's work without being asked for applause. Wrench had already arranged for Ethan to join a Saturday tutoring program. Blackjack had calls lined up for follow-ups. Smoke had left a stack of novels where Ethan liked them. The mattress was fluffed and a small nightlight placed by the bed. They were, by any measure that mattered, a family in the way that mattered most, not by blood, but by the decisions they made when someone put trust in their hands and the choice was offered to them, to keep faith or let it rail into the dark. Night slid over the clubhouse like a blanket. Men moved through the dim like stories in motion, some speaking softly, some stoking coffee, others leaning against workbenches thinking. The photograph lay on the table again, the edges soft from being handled. Reaper put a hand over it and felt like a man who had taken on a load he intended to carry. He did not know how the next months would write themselves. He knew clearly and without doubt that Ghost had left them with a ledger that carried more than a name. It held a duty. It held the simple, stubborn belief that promises matters, and that chosen family was not a phrase, but the back and forth of hands doing what needed doing. There were nights ahead in hospital chairs, small victories tied to test results, and the slow arithmetic of bills that would be paid by turning wrenches, by poker nights that meant more than money, by people who could make a system bend for someone it might otherwise forget. There would be days when Ethan's homework piled high, and a man in a leather jacket would sit down to help with long division, and nights when the sound of engines outside the clubhouse would be not a symbol of threat, but a lullaby. In the deep hours before dawn, Reaper walked out to the yard and lay on the hood of an old truck. The stars were clean and sharp above them, no answers stitched into them, only a wide sky.
He thought about Ghost, about the 2 rescues that had defined him for those who had known him, and about the way a single note could move a chapter to action. He lived on promises, in the end, the kind you answer for. He had been given one in a paper envelope and a photograph. He intended to keep it. The night smelled like oil and rain and a far-off sea. When the clubhouse lights blinked out, one by one, Ethan slept in a back room with a mattress that did not feel borrowed. In his small head, he dreamed of a man he had only seen in a photograph, of a road that might be a kind of answer, and of a group of leathered strangers who had become his family. Morning would bring the first of the tests, the first of the official scheduling, and the first of the many little fights they would have to be clever about to keep the family whole. For now, the world had narrowed to the steady breath of a woman asleep, the night watch of men who had made a promise, and a boy with a photograph. They had crossed the threshold from knowing to doing. The roads ahead were not promises of easy returns. They were, however, a path. Reaper rolled over and watched the faint glow of the clubhouse through the trees. He traced the ghost tattoo on his wrist with his thumb and felt in the slow, iron beat of his chest the reach of an obligation he had chosen to accept. Outside, a bike's engine breathed in the distance, an answer to a call. The day would come with doctor's notes and waiting rooms, and the kind of bureaucratic patience that tests resolve. They had, however, already done the first and hardest part. They had shown up. The first consult left a shape on the days that followed, appointments like anchor points on the calendar, a series of small instructions that had to be followed the way a rodeo rider follows a rope. Tests came and went, pulmonary function panels that measured breath like someone counting the length of a song, scans that drew maps of scar and tissue, and each report was translated by Blackjack into an action list in plain language. They learned that there was a procedure that could give Sarah more time and steadier breathing, an operation that would not erase what fibrosis had already taken, but could ease the labor of breathing enough to let her live with less pain and more hours. The surgeon talked of careful margins, of recovery measured in weeks and months, of physiotherapy and medications that would have to be managed. It was, Blackjack said without romanticism, a way to buy time and better quality of life. It was honest work, and honest work was something the chapter believed in. Money needed to be found. The chapter had just enough to stop an eviction, but not to carry a family through months of copays, parking fees, and the small thefts of time that bureaucracy extracts. They did what they always did. They turned the skills they had into cash, and the kindness they felt into plans.
Wrench organized weekend garage shifts, brake jobs, tune-ups, a customless hustle where men with greasy hands did what they could do best. Tank and Reaper took older bikes to small-town shows and sold parts. Blackjack arranged a poker night that raised more than anyone in the room had expected. Smoke spent long hours on the phone, quietly convincing a couple of nurses and a social worker that Sarah was the sort of person worth a hospital team bending toward. Small donations arrived in form of checks with handwritten notes, a casserole left on the clubhouse steps, a woman from the diner who brought fruit. Ethan watched all of it as a lesson in the economy of care. He learned how a wrench in the right hand could put food on the table, how a man's network could be a currency more valuable than cash, and how a promise folded into paper could ripple outward into a concert of actions. He began to catalog the things each brother did best: Tank's blunt efficiency that made furniture arrive like inevitability, Wrench's ability to turn time into tuition, Blackjack's contacts that could coax appointments out of bureaucracies, Smoke's quiet, steady presence that made hospital chairs feel less like exile. He learned that help was not a single large thing, but 100 small, competent ones. Between the hospital visits and the garage shifts, the clubhouse became a school. Wrench sat with Ethan over algebra problems, explaining ratios and torque in the same breath. Think of an equation like a gear train, he'd say, drawing circles and arrows on a scrap cardboard. Tank taught the boy how to check oil levels and change spark plugs, his hands big and patient, as he showed Ethan how to hold a wrench so the metal would not bite. Smoke borrowed a flashlight and read late into the night from dog-eared books that smelled like dust and travel, his voice low and even, until the words stitched themselves into Ethan's sleep. Sarah, when not in hospitals or therapy, found herself learning new things too. The surgery and recovery left her with cautious lungs and a humility that had room for help. Marcus came into her life's department, and who had first offered to bring a coffee, and then sat for longer than a coffee would explain. He knew names of nurses and had the kind of steady hands that made bandages feel less like restraint and more like care. He did small, important things. He brought the pills when memory failed, and picked up forms at the county office when the clubhouse couldn't spare a driver. Months bunched into a rough passage, pre-op tests and a scheduled procedure, the long hours in the hospital waiting area that became a study in how to be present. There were nights when Ethan curled on a chair next to the surgery suite and held the photograph of his father between his palms like a talisman.
There were hours when Reaper paced, his mind a methodical engine chewing on logistics and fears, trading 1,000 private equations for plans and backup plans. The morning of the operation arrived folded into blue scrubs and a quiet that felt both holy and mechanical. Men from the chapter filled 2 rows of chairs, and the waiting room turned into its own kind of liturgy. Cigarettes out in the alley for those who wanted them, cups of bad hospital coffee ceremonially refilled, poker faces softened into talk about fishing holes and old rides. They did not talk over much of the surgery itself. The men had learned the humility of medicine the way they'd learned the humility of engines. There was a protocol, and then there was the living thing in the middle of it. When the surgeon finally came out, hours later than everyone had hoped, she carried the kind of careful optimism that is partly science and partly character. "It went as well as we could ask," she said. "There are signs we can work with. She's stable in intensive care. Recovery will take time. There will be setbacks. We need to prepare for the long haul." Those last words sat in the air like a sober benediction. Reaper's face, usually unreadable, softened in a way that carried the weight of gratitude and fear at once. He clasped Blackjack's shoulder and let the bones of his hands speak for him. Ethan cried then, not loud, but a small, honest sound that braided grief and relief. The brothers crowded around in a way that did not seek to solve the problem, but to keep the room from becoming a vacuum of panic. They passed coffees, they told jokes that landed badly and still landed, they argued about the best way to get a hollandaise stain out of a jacket. The first weeks of recovery were granular. Sarah returned from the hospital with lines and devices that made breathing safer but more mechanical. A small concentrator hummed in a corner like a friendly generator. There were medications that thinned blood and steadied inflammation, schedules for checkups, and a regimen of breathing exercises that sounded like a child's game and worked like a rehabilitation plan. Hospital discharge forms folded into a planner Blackjack had turned into a ledger of care. Reaper became an expert in that work out of necessity. He learned what it meant to call the insurance company and insist on an approval. He learned the names of the admins whose compassion could not be bought, but sometimes could be earned by the tiredness of a voice that refused to stop asking. Work had to continue. They could not keep a family on goodwill alone. Wrench helped Sarah retrain for a position at a local community center that required empathy more than stamina and paid enough for her to be independent. Marcus found a part-time role that fit her rhythm. It was not glamorous, but it was steady, and it came with health benefits she could actually use.
The chapter's help turned into scaffolding that slowly, carefully let her stand on her own again. Ethan grew in ways that sometimes split the time into chapters you could read by their small seasons. He went from being a boy who had learned to watch the road for danger to one who learned to chart it. Homework hours became rituals. Wrench's Saturday tutoring turned into after-school projects, an old carburetor taken apart and reassembled into a science lesson, a physics problem made flesh by how torque and momentum made a bike wheel spin. Reaper sat with the boy sometimes into the late hours and taught him the uncelebrated parts of steadiness, how to make coffee for a person who won't ask for it, how to show up on time because being present is a kind of love, how to call someone and say, "I'm here." There were small victories stitched into the long months. Sarah's oxygen needs stabilized enough that she could ride in a truck for an afternoon without fear. Ethan's math teacher told him he had a knack for geometry. Wrench handed Ethan a small toolbox and told him, with a smile that was almost tender, that when a machine is quiet, you can read more of its life than when it sings. The clubhouse became a classroom of living things, lessons taught with grease on the hands, with late-night laughter, with the patience of men who had learned to measure help by reliability, not headlines. They did not forget Ghost. In quiet hours, Reaper would pull the photograph from the back of his wallet and study the man who had left an envelope folded with trust. Reaper's flashbacks became a private weather. He remembered the truck on a Nod stretch outside Reno, with color as sharp as if he stood there, the shriek of tires, the smell of rubber and diesel, and a hand hauling him from a path that would otherwise have written his story briefly and violently. He remembered Daniel Cole staggering, half scored by impact, laughing that quiet laugh as if the world had given them both a reprieve. He remembered sitting on a porch at dawn, beer warmed by the chill, and a conversation that had nothing to do with heroics, a man willing to hold another man's shame until daylight made things bearable. Those were memories Reaper kept folded like a map in a pocket. Not all of the chapters were steady. There were nights when the bills crept back up, and when clinic calls meant new tests and new anxieties. There were times Ethan's homework sat undone because a doctor appointment took precedence, and the boy learned how to ask forgiveness for left-behind assignments in the same breath he thanked the men who had stayed up through an IV drip. There were days when Donnelly's lawyer called, and the clubhouse answered with a formal letter and a financial plan, rather than the menace some imagined. They had learned early that dignity could be more persuasive than threats.
Donnelly's office found, in the end, that the arithmetic of a stable tenant with a plan and a community to back them was less trouble than constant skirmishes. Life moved forward in uneven sweeps. The next year, Sarah's condition stabilized enough that she could take on part-time work. The hours were short but meaningful. Marcus, who had been a name at first, became a presence. He organized rides to clinics, negotiated with suppliers for small home medical devices, and sat with Sarah in the evenings talking quietly about garden plans. A small, domestic future that smelled of basil and rain. The two of them learned how to navigate dependence and independence in a way that left room for both dignity and need. They were friends first, and then something more, the kind of partnership that grew out of reliably showing up. Ethan's school life began to open like a map. Teachers noticed his concentration, his practical intelligence, the way he could translate abstract numbers into motions and machines. Wrench helped him apply for a scholarship toward a community college mechanical engineering program. Reaper, who had never been one for speeches, walked him through the application with blunt pride, writing on a form in the hand of a man who had never learned to say, "I am proud," directly. When Ethan won a modest scholarship, the clubhouse collected around him like a chorus of quiet, fierce approval. Time, which had been an anxious companion, became a friend of a different quality. The hospital visits decreased in frequency, replaced by routine check-ins. Sarah's medication regimen adjusted and then held steady. Ethan finished high school and took the next step toward mechanical engineering. The chapters celebrated each benchmark in a way that was appropriate to men who did not like spectacle. Barbecues in the backlot, earnest toasts short and textured, hands on shoulders. Of course, life kept insisting on complexity. There were moments of relapse, a test that came back with a worrying note, a night that required oxygen adjustments, a technician who called with a delay. Those moments were met with a practical ferocity. The brothers found someone who could teach Sarah techniques that helped with breath control. They got her into community groups that taught her to pace herself. They rearranged schedules so Marcus could take a permanent job that offered better benefits. They worked the problem like they would a seized engine. Identify the point of failure, apply steady pressure, replace what must be replaced, and test things under load. When Ethan left for college, he did so with a toolbox and a photograph in his backpack. He carried the ghost tattoo's image in his head the way sailors carry stars. He called home on a schedule he had set himself. Every Sunday, a check-in that was more than duty, less than obligation, an affection rendered into habit.
The clubhouse became a stop on his longer map, a place where he could return for a meal and a lesson, and to find the men who had rearranged his life. Years shaped them. Reaper's hair silvered, Tank's gait grew a little slower, and his hands earned new scars. Wrench's jokes deepened into a kind of contented mischief. Blackjack's voice lost some high notes and gained more of a storyteller's cadence, and Smoke continued to be the slow anchor of the group, the one you watched to see how the others were faring. They were older in the way of men who had spent time on the road, faces mapped with experience, jokes that had weathered, and eyes soft where earnestness had been paid. Reaper watched Ethan grow and remembered the choices that had brought him there. The man who had saved them both, Daniel Ghost Cole, remained in the back of Reaper's mind like a lantern. There were small rituals. Each year on the anniversary of the day Ethan walked into Rusty's diner, Reaper took the photograph out, and the chapter had a quiet, private remembrance. They would talk of Ghost in ways that avoided hero worship, a man who chose to leave, who left an envelope rather than commands. They spoke of what that had meant, to choose absence for the sake of presence, to make a small sacrifice that could ripple outward. Not everything was tidy. Time takes tolls in the bodies of men, and Reaper was no exception. He found himself wheezing on long rides, feeling little pauses in breath that had not been there before. At first he dismissed them. Age, he said. He kept riding because steel and road anchored him. But there came a winter when he came indoors coughing, and Blackjack insisted he get a checkup. The tests were careful and blunt, issues in his chest that needed tending. Reaper, stubborn and practical, accepted treatment the way he'd accepted a tough repair, because to not do so would risk leaving a mess for those who came after him. The club rallied around as they always did, no fanfare, only presence. Men drove him to appointments, reworked chores, and sat up with him when sleep was frayed. The dynamic had changed. The boys they had once gathered around were now men who returned the favor. Reaper found it strange, and then he found peace in it. It was the order he had hoped for when he took Ghost's folded paper into his palm.
He had not expected gratitude as much as he expected to honor a debt. In the end, Reaper's decline was as dignified as he had tried to make his life, quiet, intentional, with friends and brothers nearby. There was a day when he sat on the back steps of the clubhouse and watched the sun set over the field like an old coin. Ethan sat beside him, taller than he remembered, and steady. Reaper gave the boy a small box, and inside was a modest thing, the ghost tattoo sketched, not as a mark to recruit, but as a piece of memory. "For when you tell it," Reaper said, voice rough with something like relief. "So you know what it looked like when he trusted us."
Reaper died some months later, not with a scene of melodrama, but with the soft, altogether human grief of men who have lost one of their own. The funeral was not a spectacle of adrenaline, but a procession of measured devotion. Engines lined the road outside the cemetery and idled in a roll call that spoke in low throbs. 20 riders from the chapter and allied clubs gathered, 20 throats and hearts and hands that remembered how Ghost's letter had been read in a diner one ordinary morning. The reverence they showed was not for a life of outlaw legend, but for a life of choices. They buried Reaper with the sort of practical ceremony the club had always been good at, a flag they had no right to, but felt they needed, stories told in short, sharp bursts that made people laugh and cry at the same time. The smell of coffee and thermoses passed between hands like a sacrament. The wall in the clubhouse, the wall where they kept the photographs and the names of those who had ridden on, found a new space. Reaper's picture went up beside Ghost's, and beneath them someone pinned Daniel's folded note in a plastic sleeve, preserved like a map. Around the clubhouse that night, the men revved their engines, not as threat, not as triumph, but as a funeral hymn. It was a sound that had been used for so many things, warning, joy, departure, but here it was simply recognition. A life had been lived, a promise kept. Life, as it does, continued. Ethan finished his degree, engineering at a state college, on a scholarship partly paid for by garage nights and partly by his own work. He returned home for visits with a new confidence and a new set of hands that fit a wrench as if they had been made for one. He worked for a small firm that did structural engineering and later opened a modest shop where he repaired engines and designed small mechanical aids for people with limited mobility. He married a woman from a neighboring town. Sarah and Marcus were there at the wedding. The clubhouse threw a party that tasted like smoked meat and steady joy. Then one summer, years after Ethan had first walked into Rusty's diner with a photograph and a note, he sat with a small boy on his knee. The boy was the color of sunlight and mischief. He had his father's eyes and a laugh that could break tension with the gentlest of punches. They named him Danny, after the man who had made the difficult decision years earlier, Daniel. Ethan told stories of Ghost as if teaching a geography, pointing to lines on a map that were made up of choices, not geography. One afternoon in late spring, with the field long and dry and the bikes lined up like a chorus of brass, Ethan took Danny to the clubhouse yard. Tank came out with a small helmet, Wrench with a low little seat that could be steadied, and Smoke with a battery of small children's books stamped with grease. They sat Danny on a small restoration bike that had been downsized for him. Ethan's hand brushed the boy's wrist as he did so.
Danny looked, as all children do, to the men with keen curiosity. "See this?" Ethan said softly, and he put his hand over the small ghost tattoo that Reaper had sketched years before and had meant for more than ornament. He told Danny the story, the simpler version, with the edges worn smooth by time. A man who left so that a family could be safe, a letter that asked strangers to be family, and a group of men who decided to be exactly that. Danny, barely tall enough to see over the tank, followed Ethan's fingers and looked at the ink like he had seen an old treasure. "My father had that same tattoo," he repeated, and the words fell out of him like the rephrasing of a handed-down secret. For the men gathered there, older, slower, faces creased with road miles, something about that repetition of the phrase folded into them like a new stitch. It was a small thing, the way children take up a story and make it their own, but it landed like a bell. They remembered the morning at Rusty's diner, when a small boy had walked in and turned the world they lived in toward care. They saw, with the lucidity of long memory, how one letter had folded into 1,000 acts. The years layered themselves like paint. The wall in the clubhouse grew more thickly arranged, a collage of nights and names. Photographs of weddings, graduations, and birthdays found space beside the old pictures of bikes and nights by gas stations. Danny grew into a boy who could already take a bike down a gentle slope and come back with his cheeks flushed like appleseed fire. He learned to count by engine revolutions and to spell in the way Wrench suggested, by understanding the grammar of machines. When Reaper's photograph faded at the edges, a small thing really, but irreplaceable, the chapter replaced it carefully.
They told stories at the replacement ceremony, not eulogies but celebrations of habit and fidelity. At each telling, Ghost's name sat there like the root of a tree that had kept growing. Their club, once considered by outsiders to be simply a knot of leather and challenge, became a place people trusted. They did not advertise their kindness, they simply kept doing it. People with little and people with more found a place at their table. A veteran seeking a quiet place to read, a single mother needing childcare during a clinic visit, a teenage boy who needed a pair of hands to steady his future. They gave small loans, they taught trades, they read resumes and held mock interviews in the back room. The clubhouse no longer looked like a refuge solely for riders, it looked like a small village of competence. In the end, the story that had begun with a tattoo and a folded note had become something smooth and durable. Promises, kept by hands that had known how to carry weight, had changed a family. Ethan's children grew up with a sense of obligation that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with gratitude.
Danny, who once echoed the phrase his father had spoken at Rusty's diner, grew into a teenager who knew that an inked ghost stood for something more than lineage. It stood for the way people answer when trust is placed in them. In a final morning that read like an epilogue, not in the sense of ending, but in the sense of a long chapter closing, Ethan took his son to the same diner where the whole thing had begun. The chrome of the bikes caught the sun, just as it had years before. The bell over the door tinkled. The jukebox offered an old tune that sounded like memory itself. Reaper's old forearm, once a map of scars and ink, was not there to be seen. His placebo was shaped in the way people moved, an absence that made room for presence. Ethan slid a photograph and a small folded note into Danny's hand. The original, now laminated, Daniel Cole's handwriting, preserved like an artifact. "If you ever need them," Ethan said, his voice steady, "find them at Rusty's." Danny looked at the inked ghost on his own small wrist, the same sketch but in new, unlined skin. He looked up at the men around him who had become his family and saw in their faces and hands a truth that needed no elaboration. Promises are kept by steady acts, not by claims. The narrator, who had watched the sun move across chrome and the slow arc of a life remade by choices, offers no sermon but an invitation. Look at your own life. Notice who shows up. Notice the people you call in the quiet hours and the ones you call in the loud ones. Notice the small folded notes you keep, literal or not, that say implicitly, "Do not let go." There are no neat endings to the sort of stories that live in real streets and hospital corridors. They're only continuities. A child who learns to ride. A wall that gathers names. A group of men with grease on their hands who understand the arithmetic of care. There is the truth that when someone leaves a promise in the world, a scrap of paper, a whispered instruction, they do not always expect it to be answered in full. They expect it to be answered enough. If this story moves you, think of who your chosen family is. Bring them a cup of coffee, call them on a hard morning, show up. Tell someone the small story of a man who left so others might survive, and then tell them what you intend to do with that knowledge. If you have a tale of someone who showed up for you when you needed hands, share it. Let it be part of the ledger. If this touched you, consider subscribing to hear more stories where ordinary promises change ordinary lives. Under the stars in the clubhouse yard, bikes lined like watchful animals, a small boy learned to open a helmet for the first time. He fitted it under his chin with concentration and climbed onto the bike with the cautious pride of a beginner. Ethan steadied the handlebars. Tank gave a thumbs up from a step away. Wrench adjusted a mirror. The little ghost on Danny's wrist seemed to brighten in the sun.
They started the engine gently, not as a roar, but as a promise taken up again. The road waited.